populations, both before and after the pandemic. Specifically, depression, anxiety, and loneliness appear to be peaking in college students. Multiple factors, including the pandemic, political unrest, and systemic racism, are contributing to students' high stress levels. During this last year, the topic of student well-being came up during each and every one of the monthly OPID Advisory Council meetings. Advisory Council members' concern for our students' mental health and well-being, coupled with our awareness of the fact that mental health and stressors are not the same across all demographics, inspired this year's Faculty College theme, Equity-Minded Wellness. We are excited and grateful to have Drs. DeBlaere and Jesse Owen joining us today and tomorrow. Dr. DeBlaere is an associate professor and program director of the Counseling Psychology Doctoral Program at Georgia State University. Her research focuses on the association between minority stressors and mental health, with a particular emphasis on the experiences of people with intersecting marginalized identities. She co-founded the Division on Multiracial and Adopted Asian Americans within the Asian American Psychological Association, and she is a fellow of the American Psychological Association. Dr. Owen is a professor in the Department of Counseling Psychology at the University of Denver. He is also a licensed psychologist and the lead psychologist at Lifelong Incorporation, a private agency that serves individuals with disabilities, including those with hidden disabilities. Additionally, Dr. Owen is the editor of the journal Psychotherapy, and his research focuses on psychotherapy processes and outcomes, multicultural orientation, as well as romantic relationships. He is also a fellow of the American Psychological Association. Drs. DeBlaere and Owen are both affiliated with the Steve Fund, which is the nation's leading organization focused on supporting the mental health and emotional well-being of young people of color. On behalf of my UW colleagues, I extend a warm welcome to both Drs. DeBlaere and Owen.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. We're just taking a second to pull up our slides. We wanted to ask, and I loved seeing in the chat, kind of folks sharing where they're coming from and kind of where they're zooming in from today. That sounds actually, as I say it out loud, a little more like the Jetsons than I intended. But yeah, so where people are coming in from today. I'll share that I'm at Georgia State, so that's in Atlanta. And that's also the lands of the Muskogee and Cherokee peoples. So maybe Jesse, do you want to share where you're zooming in from?
Sorry. Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. I'm Jesse. I'm coming in from University of Denver, and it is a lovely weather here in this great morning mountain town. So glad you're all here, and hopefully we will have a good, smooth, and seamless presentation.
Yes, and if we don't, we're just going to roll with it because that's what we're doing in the days of Zoom. And I noticed that some people are in 41-degree weather. It will be 91 degrees in Atlanta today. So, but we wanted to ask also for folks in the chat. Thank you for sharing kind of where you're zooming in from, but also maybe share what campus, discipline area, whether you're a tenure track, non-tenure track, if you're in a student affairs unit, just to get a sense for us, for Jesse and I, to get a sense of who's in the audience. We believe that most folks are faculty members in one way or another. And then we have some attendees who are also with student affairs, which that sounds like a really nice diverse group. And so, oh, thank you. So we've got folks coming in from UW-Platteville, Milwaukee, Whitewater, River Falls. Very cool. Green Bay, Stevens Point. Great. Biology professor, chemistry. So we've got some STEM folks, Office of Health and Promotion, lecturer in humanities. Great. English writing, UW Oshkosh, professional counseling, wonderful. Stevens Point. Very cool. Yeah, social work in Green Bay. Wonderful. So yes, please continue to share so that as a community, we have a sense of who's here today, and the community of folks that we'll be working with. And the next slide, in terms of our introduction, it was shared that we're affiliated with the Steve Fund, so we're advisors for the Steve Fund. The Steve Fund was established in 2014, founded by a Black family who lost their loved one, Steve, to mental illness after he graduated from Harvard and City University, and really developed this nonprofit to bring awareness and build support for mental health and emotional well-being, particularly to college students of color. And we wanted to give you a sense of what today will be like as we kind of continue to introduce ourselves. Fire Service Education Director, very neat. Professor of Chemistry, thank you. So this is a 2-day training, and hopefully folks are able to join us for both days. But they are also trainings that can stand alone. So if you're not able to do both days, and we have some new folks joining us tomorrow, that's great and totally fine. But we really did, in terms of thinking about promoting equity in student mental health, we took it in 2 parts. Day 1 is going to be really focused more on the considerations, so the unique experiences of students of color. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, but our focus really is on students of color, not as a monolithic group, because we'll also talk a little bit about intersectionality today, but really the unique stressors and unique considerations when we're trying to create inclusive communities for students of color. So that's day 1. And day 2 is talking more about the strategies, and we'll be doing that in kind of 3 different ways in terms of the relational components, aspects in the classroom and beyond. And so we do want to be inclusive of our colleagues in different student affairs or student support offices and units on campus. So that material should still be relevant across the board. So today we're going to talk about student of color's unique campus experience, the impact of those experiences on the mental health of students of color, and where we can fit in as faculty members, but not just as faculty members, and again, as folks who are coming from different units on our university campuses. And for folks who are just joining us, please feel free to share in the chat, what campus you're on, your area, whether, what role you have in the campus community, whether that's as a faculty person or working in a particular office within student affairs, for example.
Great. And I just wanted to share a little bit more about myself. I think it's sometimes tough on Zoom to fully capture who the presenters are. And so I did want to share a little bit about my identities. I'm a biracial man, white passing, or I can be white passing, depends on what I want to look like. And I'm also heterosexual. I grew up lower SES, and now I'm doing quite fine for myself. And so I do come from a lot of different types of intersecting identities that kind of drive my experiences. My mom's an immigrant to the United States, and my dad's multi-generational in the United States. And it's a really interesting combination, and maybe some of these stories might unfold, but Cirleen and I share this interesting microaggression that happens to us all the time of, what are you? And so I think that there's some pieces of who the presenters are and their backgrounds that inform our work. And Cirleen, do you want to say a little bit about yourself there?
Yes, thank you, Jesse. So I also identify as biracial, multiracial Asian. You might have guessed that from the introduction, where I co-founded a division for multiracial Asian and adoptee folks. My mother immigrated from Taiwan in her 20s, and my father's family immigrated from Belgium, so multi-generational, as Jesse shared. I'm a first generation college student. So as Jesse shared, I also grew up lower SES. My mother had a 6th grade education, and my dad was able to graduate high school. And so, yeah, in terms of all the different kind of markers of SES, in kind of one generation, we've shifted a lot within certainly within my life and probably within our family as well. And let's see, what other things? I think I identify as, strongly as an LGBTQ plus ally. And that's been a big part of my work, particularly as I've kind of looked at intersecting identities. And not only with regard to multiracial identities, but also intersecting identities, primarily looking at race, ethnicity with gender and sexual orientation.
Great. So we have the slide here, moment of presence, just because we've all been on Zoom for the last year and a half or so, and we all have interacted in Zoom in different ways. And so Cirleen and I thought for this presentation, we don't want it just to be us talking at you, that we wanted to have some small group discussions, because this type of work, as most of you know, is best integrated when it's personal. And obviously with a group this large, we can't make every single interaction personal with you, but we do hope in smaller groups that we can make some of this material come to life and applicable for the areas that you're in. And I love the fact that folks are coming in from different campuses and different backgrounds. So I do believe, we hope, or at least we hope, that that will be a useful experience. And so the next thing, is that we're going to get into small groups and share, because we're going to be doing some small group activities. And I think it's important to at least get to know each other, because when we're talking about diversity and multicultural aspects of ourselves, it's personal, right? It's not only professional, it is personal. And so just to get a little bit of comfort within your group, share a little bit about where you're coming from, what interested you in the workshop, and we'll come back in about 8 to 10 minutes.
Okay, welcome back, or as people kind of start to come back. I always find those transitions can be kind of funny. So literally, I was in a conversation where middle of a sentence and then it ends. But hopefully folks were able to get to know their groups. One of our intentions, again, as Jesse shared, we recognize that talking about issues of diversity and identity and culture, they are inherently personal. And so we wanted some of those conversations, especially with a group of this size, kind of people being able to share, not necessarily, it's not necessarily the most comfortable, or even sometimes the depth of sharing in a larger group of this size would really not be possible. So we have the smaller groups, and we also just wanted to share with you that that is the group that you're going to stay with throughout the rest of the training today. So our hope also is that your conversations deepen throughout the, I don't know, about, I guess, hour and a half or so that we have remaining. And so you'll kind of revisit and be back with that group. So we're going to move into some of the content for today. One of the things that we're really focusing on the experiences, as I shared, of students of color. And one of the reasons for this is the number of students of color has really increased over time. So at universities and colleges. And so in this next slide, this figure kind of illustrates where we are about now. And so some of the data, so this is from 2015, 2016. The number of students of color has increased to about, at the undergraduate level, 45%. So almost half of undergraduates in the United States. And it certainly moves closer to that number when you include international students, represent students of color or international students, and with about 52% of those undergraduates being white. And this is a shift from even 25 or 20 years ago or so. So in the academic year of 1995-96, the proportion of students of color was about 30%, with less than 1% undergraduates. So, so it was 70% white students at that time. In terms of graduate enrollment, the numbers are comparable, but a little bit higher. So the 56% of all graduate students identify as white, and 32% domestic students of color. And then you see a larger number of international students at that graduate level. This is, again, comparable to, let's say, 20 years ago in terms of the shift. So 20 years ago, about 75% of graduate students identified as white, with about only 20% of students identifying as domestic students of color. And even the international student number has gone down. So about 20 years ago, only 4%. of graduate students were students of color. So another thing I'll share, because we do want to kind of think about that intersectionality piece, is there also have been, it's almost half, but it's a little bit more enrollment by women. And there are kind of disparities by racial ethnic groups. So, so for example, for Black students, it's about 6-4. So about 60% of African-American and Black students are women and 40% are men. And so, and as we've started to acknowledge multiracial folks, there are disparities there as well. So we want to just give you a sense of how the numbers of students of color have shifted. However, that isn't necessarily as reflected in the faculty. So even though we have about half, we're moving towards that number very quickly, half of students identifying as students of color, we have almost 3/4 of our faculty. So this includes tenure track, non-tenure track lecturers, kind of all faculty that students would engage with identify as white, with much smaller proportions of other racial and ethnic groups. So 9% Asian, about 6% African-American and Black, 4 to 5% Hispanic or Latinx identifying. The numbers get worse when you start to kind of move into administration. So if you look at the percentage, for example, of provosts, that number starts to get that's in the 80-something percentile of white faculty there. There are certain areas like student affairs where you'll see more folks of color, but overwhelmingly, as you move into higher ed administration, it becomes a much more predominantly white space. And then this gets really pronounced when you start to move into presidents. So when you look at, so we provide this information to kind of illustrate that we just don't have, when we look on university campuses, we don't have the representation that's commensurate with our student body. And the reason we highlight that, not only as an equity issue, but it's one of, there are multiple ways, and we're going to watch a little video in a minute that talks about this, that lend themselves, there's multiple circumstances that lend themselves to creating an environment that either feels inclusive or isolating to students of color. And they're not all things that happen or are directly said, but things like seeing the folks that are in positions of power not necessarily reflecting their identities can be particularly isolating for students of color. And indeed, the data bear this out. So when you look in a study in 2017 that was done by the Steve Fund in conjunction with a few other organizations, in asking how often or do you often feel isolated on campus, almost half of students of color will say that versus 1/3 of white students. And this is not to say that white students are not experiencing stressors, they absolutely are. So, I mean, 30% is not a small number. But we would argue, and I think the research bears this out, that students of color experience all those same stressors and then more, and then unique ones related to race, ethnicity, and racial climate on campuses. Whereas when you look at describing your campus as inclusive, 45%, so it's an inverse, many more students of European or white background would identify their campus as inclusive versus less than 1/3 of students of color.
Cirleen, there's a question here in the chat. Sarah asked, when looking at the representation of college students at the university, how does this compare to the overall US population?
That's great. That's a great question. It would, right now, depending on the racial ethnic group, there is comparable representation of Asian folks and underrepresentation of African-American, Black, Latinx folks. And when you talk about, when we talk about Indigenous folks, multiracial folks, that gets a little bit more complex because it kind of can depend. And so one of the things I was actually sharing during the break is if you look at the data from 20 years ago, we actually don't really have good comparison data, for example, for multiracial folks, because we just didn't ask. So if you look at multiracial as an identity today, that would also be a group that would be highly underrepresented. And then if we talk about Indigenous folks, also underrepresented. So it depends on biracial ethnic group, both at the faculty level and the student level, obviously.
Great, thank you. And for
Thank
others,
you for the question.
If you do have questions, thank you, sir, for throwing that into.
So as I was sharing, again, we acknowledge that all students have challenges. A university, whether you're doing undergraduate or graduate, has unique challenges. I know a lot of our students have been feeling the financial burdens, particularly this year, particularly within families as folks have lost jobs. There's been illness, there's been death within families. And so this has been a particularly tough year, I think, in terms of stressors across the board. But, we are talking about and wanting to highlight the additional stressors and the unique stressors that students of color can experience on university campuses. And so we're just going to watch this video. It's about 9 minutes or so. And it's the one right underneath that one, Jesse, not that one. Keep on going. Yeah. Jesse, I think you have to unmute your audio for folks to hear it. Maybe.
Sorry, say that again.
Is your I think it might, I don't know if your audio is muted or not.
Oh, gotcha.
Experienced by campus members. Scholars often use campus climate as a frame to deepen their understanding of campus unrest issues. For instance, those facing particular student populations, such as students of color on a predominantly white campus, but all campuses, regardless of their makeup and structures, have a climate that's made up of norms of interactions and practices of its members.
And there are various components of campus climate. So it includes how people interact with one another, right? The quality of those interactions. Are people being validated and seen on campus? Are they being supported? What messages does the campus send people?
Yeah, I think a lot of factors affect student of color well-being, and one of those is the campus climate, right? In terms of what's happening, not only in terms of like the administrative narrative around diversity and equity and inclusion, but what's happening on their floor in their dorm, what's happening in their classroom.
Campus climate can affect student mental health, really, in my mind, in two ways. One is on the kind of interpersonal day-to-day basis with things like microaggressions, which are basically micro insults, where a person would treat a student of color in a negative or dismissive way. Another level, the way that a campus climate can affect student of color mental health is through some of the incidents that might occur on a campus and affect the campus on the whole. For instance, the Charlottesville rally with people walking with torches through campus. And not only did the campus see that, but the whole nation did. And it really underscored the severity of that image and just the reality of that act, creating fear. This can happen on two levels, the everyday one-on-one, as well as the more global, where everyone gets to see it, but it still has a devastating impact on the whole campus.
I think oftentimes when we think of climate, it's easiest to think about those incidents of bias and discrimination, like a student hearing or being party to unkind remarks or bigoted statements or ad hominem attacks. I think it's a lot harder to be thoughtful about all the many ways in which students experience isolation and being excluded.
So if we think about predominantly white campuses, for example, a student of color on that campus is likely to not see adequate reflections of themselves in the people that they interact with on a daily basis. And it becomes even more stark when they interact with professors, because we know that professors are highly disproportionate in terms of race. About 70% of professors identify as white, which means only 30% identify as people of color. So if institutions do not recognize that there are campus climate issues that create divides between students as opposed to bridges or conduits of communication that are effective, where students can authentically share about their experiences with each other, then the opportunities for learning and for building that cohesive community are missed.
If on a given campus that certain incidents of bias occur, and then nobody does anything about that to rectify the situation or to bring the perpetrators to justice, that creates an environment in which the student of color would not feel safe, that somehow they're not valued enough, that their safety in that space is taken care of, is monitored and addressed.
And so if students are feeling invalidated, if they're feeling as if they don't belong, if they're feeling as if the institution doesn't truly see who they are, that can also have an impact on their dignity, which is an aspect that really hasn't been studied. But conceptually, what that would mean is that they start to not see themselves as worthy for being there, which might be a cause of them separating from that environment, which can then lead to the disparities that we see in education, where there are lower educational attainment rates for people of color as compared to their white counterparts.
I think the University of Michigan and universities like the University of Michigan really have an obligation to those students who they've invited to their campuses to take care of them holistically. These are not just consumers of the education that we provide, but they're learners who are joining our community. So what does that mean fully? We've asked them to be prepared to come to us, and we need to be prepared for them to come to us. So with all of that, I think there's an obligation for us to provide spaces where they do feel affirmed, where they don't feel like they're interrogated or questioned, or there's suspicion about their participation on campus. We need to provide spaces where there's people who understand their backgrounds and can help them make meaning of their transition from their communities to a campus like the University of Michigan. I think there's also an obligation for us to have their education reflect their ambitions, their motivations, not just for a career, but how they might want to be in this world.
So one of the key ways that we can support the healing of students of color is to do our work as faculty, as administrators, as people who have power on campus to create policy, norms, practices.
Some of those are implementing an inclusive excellence framework for the entire institution, which recognizes that the structures and policies are often behind or instigate a lot of the issues that create a hostile campus climate. And so an inclusive excellence framework makes us interrogate our policies, makes us interrogate our structures.
The president of the university and the administration needs to make it clear, how important the mental health and well-being of all students are on their campus, including students of color. And that pronouncement can be it can trickle down into the actual policies and practices of the university. What types of resources are available to ensure that students of color feel welcome? What types of groups and spaces are made available for them? What types of personnel are put in leadership positions to ensure that their needs are met?
I think the point there is to say that as faculty, as administrators, as people who are anchors in an institution, it's somewhat our responsibility to help students get the common language, the common knowledge of history around dynamics and of race and racism, so that they can be more well-versed and understand how it impacts their daily lives and have a better appreciation for how all of us have a role in improving campus climate.
So why is it worth it to work on campus climate? An unfortunate reality is that acts of hate, racism, sexism, and other isms will continue to occur in our society nationally, and some will trickle into our college campuses. But by establishing a positive campus climate, we can actually reduce the incidence of these types of events. And when they do occur, that having a positive climate can allow people to have a sense of community, a sense of solace, and a sense of support that allows them to continue to thrive and meet the goals that they set for themselves. In contrast, by having a negative climate, we can actually exacerbate the negative impacts of societal hate, racism, hate acts, and other types of isms on the lives of students and other community members on our campuses. And in fact, it can undermine the actual efforts that we're doing on our campuses to improve climate. So creating a positive climate is actually creating a psychologically resilient climate for all of us.
So that video captures a lot of some of the stuff that we just talked about, so Dr. Rivera talked about the, that there isn't necessarily the same representation among faculty and administrators of folks of color as there are among the student body. And then Dr. Prim talked about more topics that we're going to bring up, which is, for example, experiences of microaggression and the impact on the health and wellness of students of color. And then one thing that we also wanted to share is it's not only, so when we talk about our campus community and trying to be inclusive of students of color, the importance of also being inclusive and affirming of our faculty of color as well. And so in a study of almost 1,700 faculty that was shared in 2021, and that was part of it was done, and the PI for that study is at Boston University's School of Public Health, and this was something that was done in collaboration across multiple foundations. But of those faculty, 58% of the Latinx faculty believe their institution is hostile or somewhat hostile towards students of color. Almost 4 in 10, about 40% of African American and Black faculty said that, and about a quarter of Asian and Asian American faculty had that sense too, that maybe we're not doing as good a job as we could in supporting our students of color on campus. Yes, so I actually looked at, and it was comparable to the Asian faculty. So to the question, do you know how many white faculty thought this? It was I think it was between 20 and 24%. So it was comparable to what the Asian faculty reported. In terms of unique stressors, so I really appreciate the way that video talks about campus climate and how it's really multifaceted. But what I find really encouraging about it too is really contextualizing campus environment and campus climate within kind of the larger sociocultural context. And I think sometimes it can be really easy as a faculty member. I think I can speak for at least my own experience. I think it's really important, and one of the things that I really try to do is contextualize my students' experience within the larger social, cultural, and political environment. And so one of the things that I really appreciate was talked about is, we have an opportunity on university campuses to create, and I loved the idea that we are inviting students onto our campuses, and we have an opportunity to either create something that would be a protective factor and promote psychological resilience, or can amplify and further undermine the mental health and wellness of students of color. So campus climate is multifaceted, and I think a lot of those aspects were talked about. It's not just how something, whether or not it feels inclusive in this kind of, there's the perception piece, and then there's the behavioral piece and those experiences, but it is also the top-down process of what are our institutional policies and procedures around inclusivity. And I really appreciated too, when things happen, whether it's in the classroom, whether it's within a college or a department, or whether it's at the university level, what is the responsiveness? Is there a responsiveness that, you know, so the idea that to say nothing is can be complicit or is complicit, or can be kind of in an indirect way saying this is okay. So what are we doing to kind of enhance our campus and environment so that all students, frankly, can feel safe? So campus racial climate is a specific aspect of campus climate, which is the institutional context, members' attitudes, the perceptions, behaviors, and also I think it's really important to highlight this last part, expectations around issues of race, ethnicity, and diversity. So do students, for example, trust that if something were to happen, because things happen. I mean, look at the, you know, broader, the incidents in just kind of broader US society, and if we look internationally, you know, so when you look outside of our university kind of bubbles, but in the university, like what would a student of color say they would expect would happen if something were to occur in a classroom or in the university campus? Would there be action? Would there be a promotion of their safety? And so this is just a figure kind of just talking about all of these things, and we've kind of hit on some of these. So the behavioral pieces are what's happening. Are there, you know, is there action in place? Are there psychological supports for students of color? This in the center, right? Because we talk about whatever the policies and procedures are, like what the kind of the policies that are being put out, or the programming that's being put out at the organizational level, is that supportive and inclusive? I think the historical narrative is huge. So one of the things, another thing that I do in association with the Steve Fund is work with different college campuses, and we're kind of doing that now. And one of the things that we ask campuses to do is a historical narrative, and in particular, a racial narrative. So because I think one of the things, and I know now, having been a faculty member for whatever number of years, 10, 12 years, you know, we can kind of be removed from the narratives of students, but the stories of the racial narratives of universities are passed among students. And so when there are instances or things that have happened, those are things that become part of the campus for the students, the campus climate for students of color. So do we as faculty, and do we as administrators, and do we in student affairs, are we aware of what those historical narratives are for students on our campus? And if we're not, we should be, and we should educate ourselves, because those are important narratives that contextualize our students' experiences. And then we talked about composition and diversity of a campus as a contributing factor as well. So again, that part that's not verbal, but when you look around, do you see other folks? It's a quick and dirty way as a psychologist, you know, I can speak to the fact that we have schema for things. It's a quick and dirty way to look around and be like, okay, is this a place that's probably a place that's going to be welcoming and affirming for folks like myself? So we're gonna move from campus climate, but all these parts are aspects of campus climate, to talking about, so we talked about it more broadly, to talking about some specific stressors, and there are also aspects that can contribute to campus climate. They are, we're going to talk about microaggressions, racial trauma, internalized oppression, and all of that kind of goes into this idea of this can be an isolating experience for students of color, which I will say, I think we all, over the last year and a half with the COVID pandemic and quarantine, a lot of our mental health stressors, and I think for folks in this room, but folks on the call today, has also, I think, been a reality for all of us in terms of the increases in anxiety and depression and stressors related to isolation. And so I think that's only been amplified this year, and certainly the data bear that out, that students of color, even prior to COVID, there might have been disparity in terms of prevalence of mental health concerns, but that's still only being amplified by the stressors associated with COVID.
Great. So I'm going to talk a little bit about microaggressions. I think most of you probably are familiar with this term, but it actually dates back quite a long time. And these are these subtle, stunning, kind of automatic put downs around people's identities. It doesn't necessarily have to be about race. It can be about gender, it can be about sexual orientation. Most of the times these are unintentional, right? Most of the times people are really well-intentioned individuals, and they may not even be aware that they are engaging in these kind of communications. And so the nice thing about this kind of concept and this term is that it names something, at least in our experience, where we really are putting people in this place of ambiguity, right? So in one of our studies led by our colleague, Dr. Hook, found that therapists also commit microaggressions. He found in this study 82%. In another study, I found about 55% of therapists commit at least one microaggression during counseling. And if we think about everyday life microaggressions, we can see a lot of instances of folks engaging in microaggressions. So the types of microaggressions are listed here. I'm not going to go through each one, but a lot of these just kind of deny people's experience. Right? And one of the interesting example of this, in my experience, has been this second-class citizen, for instance, is one of the common microaggressions where the person doesn't necessarily feel like they quote unquote belong here. And that gets sent in a lot of different ways, similar to alien in their own land. Like, where are you really from? Those kind of comments kind of suggest that you don't really belong here. Thinking about environmental microaggressions, think about what's being displayed on your campuses, what's being displayed in your offices. How inclusive are those spaces? Pathologizing cultural beliefs, another one that we see quite a bit on academic campuses, where there's certain belief systems or certain ways of being that are seen as maybe even criminal or less than. And this is a interesting just kind of narrative that was done quite a few years ago, but these are really interesting microaggressions. Are you even legal? We saw a big spike in hatred towards immigrants through the last 4 or 5 years. You can see the response will never be a real woman for somebody who identifies as trans. So a lot of these microaggressions basically just say you're not who you say you are, you don't belong here. And yet it's not the racist attacks that we see, like the overt racist attacks where people are getting physically hurt, but emotionally hurt, right? So we do want to differentiate this from just straight out racism where people are getting physically attacked, killed, murdered. That's different than what we're talking about here. These are the more microaggressions that happen on a daily basis. Myself and a few colleagues did a recent meta-analysis that demonstrated microaggressions in everyday life, not in counseling per se, were negatively associated with psychological well-being, explaining about 8.6% of the variance. And the reason why we present this slide in particular is that there's some controversy that microaggressions aren't real or don't exist. And microaggressions by nature are what we call a perceiver effect. So the perceiver gets to determine if it was or wasn't a microaggression. And the reason why this is an interesting concept as a perceiver effect is that it's parallel to another perceiver effect, which is social support, right? I could pretend, or I could express a lot of support like for Cirleen, but if she doesn't experience it as social support, then it's probably not all that effective. But I can't sit there and tell her, hey, I'm being supportive to you, you have to accept it. And that's just not gonna work. And so we try to think about this as a perceiver effect and try to step back and have some humility that these things can happen. Everybody has probably said or done something that is somewhat on the microaggression scale. And that's just life. But it's more important to admit and kind of accept these kind of pieces than to ignore them. And an interestingly connected line of research is this idea of information avoidance. And so when people feel uncomfortable, a lot of times they avoid information, they try to deny that that event even happened, which perpetuates systems of racism. So some of these challenges, like I'm mentioning here, is it represents a clash of reality. And that is, you could actually have a person who's really well-intentioned. You're the professor, you are a campus leader, and you're engaging with the students, and you might have said something that is offensive, but you don't perceive it to be that, or you didn't intend it to be that, right? It's an unintentional expression. And so throughout this training, and especially tomorrow, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into this, but think about the concept of cultural humility. And what does it mean to have some sense of humility that you might not necessarily understand the experiences of other people, but you should, and you should want to be motivated to do so. The other piece that there was some challenges to this microaggressions is that it's kind of a catch-22 in terms of responding. And that is, right, like if you do acknowledge it, is it like if you're the person who received it, if you do mention it, then you're now in this kind of interesting interpersonal interaction where you're calling somebody out, and is that really your responsibility, or is it the perpetrator's responsibility? So there's a lot of these things that where the victim is really in a catch-22 about what to do. And across different studies, and this is, I know we have folks that are not just faculty here, but microaggressions happen all across campus, in residence halls, classrooms, just on the lawns. And this is not necessarily just for white campuses, but it also seems to spike when it's predominantly white campuses. Okay, so we've been talking at you for a good bit now, and what we want to do now is move you back into the breakout rooms to talk, so you guys can talk and kind of contextualize, how do you manage microaggressions in your classes or in your units? What's gone well, what's gone less well? What have you seen that really works? These can be more complex when it's a very small class of like maybe say 8 or 10 people versus a huge lecture class of like 300. What are those dynamics like for you in your situation? So we're going to move to this breakout room for about 8 to 10 minutes again, and we will hopefully put you back there. Oops.
The question went away too fast.
Well, we will put it in the announcements.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, of course. All right, as everybody's coming back, we're about to head into the break, but before we do that, we would like to invite you to drop in the chat what came up in your discussion groups. What kind of nuggets of wisdom have you gone through, or that you learned from each other about how to manage microaggressions? And I also wanted to share a couple examples from my own teaching, and one example that's actually something that's a microaggression that's also interestingly that because it's not on college campuses, it's outside of the campus that can affect faculty and students. So at the UW-Madison campus, for instance, there was a faculty targeted by a more conservative group because she studied trans issues and very socially active in the trans community. And this group basically said, why is the public funding this? And so those kind of messages really sends really a negative message, not only to this faculty person, but her lab and the students and the trans community, right? So you can see the trickle down effect that can happen with these microaggressions in a really negative way. I think in my classes, one thing that I've tried to do with managing microaggressions is slowing down the pace of the class and really trying to take some time to process the microaggression and to try to invite the person who's stated the microaggression to just be more curious about like, hey, I heard this, I'm curious about your intention around this comment because it didn't quite land well for me, right? So those kind of like more curiosity statements I think sometimes can be a way to engage a discussion versus putting people on blast. Like that was racist, don't do that, right? So just slowing down the class, it might take a little bit longer, but that in the long run, people are going to feel a little bit more included and a little bit better as a class. Mm-hmm. So as you go into sharing those, Cirleen, we're at break time, is that correct?
That's correct. So we're going to do about 10 minutes, let people stretch their legs, grab a snack, and then we're going to come back. Yeah, I really appreciate what's being shared in the chat as well, asking the curiosity piece, what you said, Jesse. And the only other thing I would add, and it sounds like folks are engaging this, is recognizing that for us as faculty members, that we do have power in the room. And so a lot of times, you know, and students of color have, you know, can share this or will share this, that sometimes something happens and they feel like they're pulled into a situation. So Jesse talked about that catch-22 where they're expected to respond in some way. And I think us as faculty or whatever positions we hold on campus, recognizing that oftentimes in some of these spaces, or certainly in our classroom spaces, we can dictate a culture. We strongly influence the culture. And so one of the things that I also try to do when I ask the question, that's intentionally taking the pressure and the attention away from students, because somebody might look, you know, it's a microaggression towards a particular group of people, and people might look to the student and be like, how are they, you know, and use them as a barometer, and it's just not fair, frankly. And it also adds a lot of additional stress. So as faculty, if we can be the people who recognize, oh, this just happened, I might not perfectly know how to respond to it, but I can respond to it and start to take the lead in terms of approaching that calling in somebody was saying, but also in another way protecting, and not in a paternalistic way, but really kind of creating more safety space for our students of color, that, oh, like, and even if you don't do it perfectly, it's like, oh, Dr. Owen, something happened, and he acknowledged that it happened, and we tried to do something. And that can really increase the safety, the sense of safety for students in our classrooms. So I just wanted to kind of remind us, I think sometimes it can feel like, as we're going through our day and all of these other things, and I know sometimes I don't necessarily always feel like in control of my class, but also recognizing that, in fact, I certainly have the most power oftentimes in the room, even, you know, and my identities, sometimes as a woman of color, I don't always, I think navigating that can be unique, but by being the instructor, really trying to take some of the pressure and the focus to somebody who has more of the power in the room to move that dialogue forward in a way that can be healing and helpful.
Great comments in there in the chat. Thank you. And yes, we did. We will send out some more recommended readings and that defines microaggressions and respond. So that's taking us right to the 10-minute stretch leg. We'll be at the top of the hour. Okay, so at the end of this training, Cirleen and I will be sharing out some resources on microaggressions, different types of articles that have highlighted not only microaggressions against racial ethnic minorities, but also trans folks, LGBT folks, microaggressions against women as well. So yeah, we'll send you those resources, as well as some resources about like a microaggression toolkit that you'll have to shape it to make it your own, but that is something that we hope will fit. Tomorrow we'll be addressing some of these questions a little bit more depth, but one of the ideas of like systemic pieces that you might be doing as a faculty member is think about your syllabus, right? It all starts with the syllabus. What are your learning objectives? Are they inclusive? Do they include anything about understanding the history and diversity of the topic that you're teaching? And obviously there's a lot of people here from different disciplines, but think about who's represented in your syllabus. Are there people of color or different identities represented in the readings that you're doing? Or is there anything about how you're selecting textbooks, right? If we go back to Cirleen's slide about the 70% of faculty or so are whites, that probably means 70% of books that are written are probably also written by white folks. Think about the differences that you could probably do if you did a little bit digger deeping about supplemental readings. Also think about, who you're like, are you creating space? Are you creating time to have conversations about larger social issues that are happening, right? We hear a lot of the times from students, it'd be great if our professor just took 10 minutes or 15 minutes out of our class, one time at least, just to talk about what's happening here. I'm not regulated very well. I think it's also interesting to think through around, is that your responsibility as a faculty to take time out of your class to talk about the George Floyd in particular situation, right? Like, yes, we would argue yes. I think some faculty have different views on that, and we've heard that over the years that we've been doing these types of trainings and perceptions. But the real question is, what's going to be best for your students to learn, right? What's going to set them up to feel like the space is there for them to not only be supported intellectually, but also emotionally, and be connected. If we think about just the point of higher education, is to help people grow, right? It's not just grow in this content area, it's grow as a human. And so what's your role in that space as well? And we also know that this is a very fine line, right? Some students are going to want to talk about this, some students are not. That's always our challenge as educators, is how do you balance all the different needs, the different preparation, the different levels of awareness of students. And also as faculty of color in particular, or faculty from minoritized backgrounds, what do you do when students microaggression you, right? So there's this weird power dynamic as a faculty member, but then there's this other dynamic that's happening. And so when we talk about like humility and taking a stance of humility, sometimes for faculty of color, that's a tough stance to take. Do you really want to be curious about where their racist ideas come from? Do you really want to join with them? And so one of the things that we encourage folks to do is to think about what kind of relationship do you want to have with this person, and what's going to be best to foster that relationships, right? Microaggressions are a special case of just general ruptures in relationships, but comes with a heavy, heavy lens of diversity, right? So like this idea that it's a rupture, it's a tear in the relationship. And the real question for all of us is like, to what degree do we want to repair that relationship? So those are questions that we can't answer for you, but we hope that you start to think about, what is my role here? What do I want to do? And if your main gut feeling is, this is a very uncomfortable conversation to have with a student or a colleague, I don't want to do it, then that's probably going to perpetuate that cycle, right? That student's probably going to do that to another faculty or another person. So you might not have the emotional bandwidth to deal with it in the moment, and that's okay, but you can always come back to that conversation down the road. Cirleen, did you have more to share?
No, I think I really appreciated all that you shared, and just in the chat had kind of said that we're going to talk about a lot of these things in more specifically tomorrow. And also in terms of what you were talking about, somebody had shared about, sharing your reasoning for why you're doing certain things. And I shared that, you can also involve students in their own learning. So asking them to participate in selecting readings. The other thing is, I really appreciated what Faye did to start us off in terms of talking about the lands in which we inhabit, right? And acknowledging the First Nations. And so I think there's a part too that what I appreciated too is that there's one that's already been written and written collaboratively, which is sometimes a critique of some of the statements, is that they are not in fact written collaboratively. So the fact that the Wisconsin system has that, a question I would have is, do folks include it in their syllabus? And if they don't, why not? And then when you do we talk about it? So not only just including things in our syllabus, but engaging in that conversation. Again, tone setting as the leaders, the people who hold the power in the room.
Absolutely. I think that's the other piece. Like, it's one thing to put it in the syllabus. It's another thing to actually have a conversation about it and have the students understand, what does this mean for our class, and what does it mean for you to be on this campus? And so I think, just putting it on your syllabus and being like, there's land acknowledgement, is not really in the spirit of what the land acknowledgement is truly there for.
Yes, and I'll share that my partner, and I kind of tease him about this sometimes, he'll talk about how he likes to make the first day syllabus day. And it doesn't really matter whether he's working with doctoral students or masters. So when he's prepping his class, he'll be like, oh, that's okay, it's syllabus day. So he doesn't have to do lectures and things. But I guess I would say, or challenge us or invite us to think about, what would syllabus day look like if part of what syllabus day was putting things with some intentionality on our syllabus, and then spending this day that we're going to talk about syllabi anyway, our syllabus anyway, to really have that be a class that's about tone setting, a class that's about promoting inclusivity in our classrooms in really explicit ways.
Absolutely. I did want to get to one question. Somebody asked the question about, is there research on the nonverbal behavior of microaggressions? And to my knowledge, Cirleen, I might be wrong on this, but there's not a lot out there about nonverbal portions of microaggressions. But that's a fascinating area to think about.
Yeah, there's not necessarily the research on that. I was thinking about some of Daryl Wing Sue's work where, I mean, they'll have examples, but it's not actually in some of the assessments. But for example, they'll share a picture of like university administrators, and then maybe the picture is like, you know, these are all the past presidents of whatever university, and then share the picture, and like it's basically a series of white men, and just asking, okay, what does this communicate to students? What is it, or faculty or other, I mean, what does this communicate to the community? So there's a lot of examples of some of those nonverbal things, but I'm not sure that I've seen it on some of the assessments that have been developed related to microaggressions. Good question.
All right, we're going to move on and to the next portion of this. Thank you for all the questions and all the comments, and there's a lot of good stuff that we'll be able to take home.
Thanks, Jesse, for managing our slides. So we've talked about microaggressions, campus climate, and so we're, you know, and really we're trying to bring that together into this idea and understanding of racial trauma more broadly. So race-based traumatic stress, Dr. Robert Carter wrote a paper on this in 2013, kind of introducing the idea. It's not necessarily that race-based traumatic stress is equivalent to PTSD or the same thing. And in fact, people really want to make that distinction, but it's really starting to understand that there's this cumulative effect. So there's incidents of stress, but that also similar, you know, when we use stress models of understanding that stress not only has acute effects, but it can also have chronic effects. And so that there's this mental and emotional injury that's caused. So like, you know, these microaggressions, I don't know how many of you have seen the, you know, like the mosquito bite example of like, you just get one bite, but after a while you're covered in bites, and you might've been like able to kind of, address one or be okay, but like after, you know, a lifetime or an entire year or an entire course of like having these incidents occur, that it really can have a negative effect on one's well-being. So, but with race-based traumatic stress, it's not just the microaggressions, it's experiencing other forms of racial bias and ethnic discrimination. It's a systemic racism. And I think that's really been at the forefront of, you know, parts of the Black Lives Matter movement in this past year related to, for example, policing, and also hate crimes. So that's been at the forefront when we talk about the incidence of at least 150% incidence increase in hate crimes, anti-Asian hate crimes. And then we're not even really, you know, that's in addition to the, you know, feeling of anti-immigrant sentiment that also extends to folks in terms of documentation status. So there's been a lot of groups, a lot of identities that have been threatened and over the past year and a half. I mean, it's not just the last year and a half, but I think there's been a particularly kind of acute, I think in the midst of kind of multiple pandemics, of the impact of traumatic stress for folks of color. One of the other things I really wanted to highlight was that I think sometimes when we think of trauma, we think of it has to be the thing that happened to the person. And that it has to be a personal experience. So if I didn't have it happen, I'm not impacted by it. And we actually just know that that's not true. So we just know that when it comes to trauma, vicarious trauma is very real. And so people will sometimes talk about, you know, for example, intergenerational trauma. And actually that research was first conducted with Indigenous Native American folks, and talking about the ways in which trauma can be passed down generationally. That's as one aspect, for example, of vicarious trauma. But we know that proximity matters, and that's both physical and interpersonal. And some of that research really started after 9/11, of people realizing that literally the mileage you were away from the Twin Towers, your mental health was impacted. So it's that, but it's also, do you know anybody, or did you know anybody? You know, even one or two people removed impacts mental health. And so I cite a study that one of my doctoral students and I co-authored. It's in Press. And so Dr. Prim spoke about the Charlottesville rally in particular. So we did a study on the Charlottesville rally with approximately 400 folks of color in Virginia. And it absolutely bore out that if you knew someone who was directly impacted or you lived closer, you know, there was an impact. Also, this moderates. So that means that for folks who have an experience or already have experiences, when you have a proximity to someone who's experienced a racial trauma, that can exacerbate the impact of your own trauma on your mental health. And I would also add that it's media, social media. So watching this, you know, being exposed on the news can be vicarious trauma. Hearing about it from somebody else can be vicarious trauma, but certainly, you know, being in the same classroom or being on a campus certainly can be examples of vicarious trauma. And here are just some examples of things that can happen. And there might be things that you might observe in students. So, you know, avoiding places might be not necessarily this year, but avoiding being in class or turning our camera off, avoiding certain activities, having difficulty concentrating. So you might have had a student who seemed to be doing pretty well and then is really struggling and not able to maintain focus in class, or lost interest in their major or lost interest in your class, starts using more substances, you know, so that's another thing, or seems really tired, and that could be because they're having nightmares or sleep difficulties. These are just some examples of some of the things that can result or be impacted by racial trauma. This list, by the way, is in no way exhaustive, because everybody's going to manifest their trauma in a way that's specific to them. But there is certainly some overlap, and this kind of gives you some sense of what some of that might look like. In terms of research, there's been a lot of research looking at the impact of, for example, microaggressions, and campus climate on the mental health and well-being of students of color. So we know that it's related to lower self-esteem. So when we're talking about, so we're kind of moving into talking about the mental health impact of microaggressions, campus climate, racial trauma. So we know that it's lower self-esteem, more depression, higher anxiety, more anger feelings. So I think sometimes, you know, really understanding anger feelings as an aspect of sometimes it can be a cry for help, particularly with men who are socialized not to experience or reflect sadness or express sadness. More binge drinking. So like, it's not just, you know, feelings of depression and anxiety manifested in, you know, sad feelings, but also ways of coping that may be less healthy than others. Higher levels of cultural mistrust and lower psychological well-being. So, you know, cultural mistrust, not necessarily, you know, starting to be a little bit more wary of culturally different folks. And then institutional racism. So feeling like your campus or your institution is not supportive of you as a person of color is related to amotivation, which is not being motivated in school, like not persisting towards degree, you know, attainment, for example. So, and actually there's some interesting research that shows that campuses that are perceived to be discriminatory or have a more negative climate, not only negatively impact students, but actually can impact faculty. And that makes sense not only in the fact that we're also people, and so we're negatively impacted, but you know, one barometer of that was faculty productivity. And so it can actually impact our ability to kind of do the research and kind of do some of the activities that we need to do to move forward in our careers. There are also the impacts and due to kind of, again, we're going to provide additional information because there's just so much, but we did want to highlight that increasingly there's an awareness of not only the perceived or the, you know, the experiences of microaggressions or other forms of discrimination, but there's the internalized oppression piece, right? So we can't, you know, we can't kind of like swim in, you know, a culture of bias and not think that we don't breathe any of that in. And so, you know, some of the research increasingly that's talking about the impact of internalized oppression. So we kind of sometimes talk about internalized oppression as in folks with more privileged identities kind of internalizing bias. But for folks of color or, you know, LGBTQ plus folks and women, just thinking about different marginalized identities, we also internalize those messages. And so there can be a sense, for example, the ways that it might manifest. Imposter phenomenon is very, very common. There's a body of research looking at imposter phenomenon with students of color. First generation college students can have this too, where it's like, you don't necessarily feel like you belong. Any successes you have, you attribute to it's probably lucky, or you're much more likely to externalize your successes and internalize any challenges or perceived failures. And it can be really stressful because you're basically just waiting for people to figure out you don't belong there. There's also stereotype threat, which is basically, you have you're aware of a stereotype, like I shouldn't ask for help, or maybe people think I'm not as good at math, for example, if we're talking about some gender stereotypes, or I'm not as smart, which is a lot of racial ethnic minority groups. And you activate that, it's activated by, something that happens in class. And so students, just by the very fact of being on a college campus, stereotype threat can be activated because maybe I don't think I belong here. And so I'm afraid that I'm going to prove the stereotype right, which we actually know in psych research actually reinforces that, and people actually end up performing worse. So students of color, before they even have actions enacted upon them, also are battling or dealing with the internalized forms of oppression that would maybe circumscribe some of their opportunities to begin with. And so I think as faculty, just being aware of that, and sometimes that requires us to reach out and really affirm a person's sense of belonging, but all of their resilience and qualities that they bring. So we know that imposter phenomenon and some of these things is related to diminished well-being for students of color, and higher levels of depression and anxiety. Also, they feel less sense of control, diminished purpose in life. So these really have impacts that are negative on the mental health and well-being of students of color. Yes. So we're going to go into, again, a breakout space. And thinking about what examples of racial trauma you might have observed and what have you done to help. So, and some of this, and we can include any and all of what we've discussed. It might be, some of the symptoms that you might feel like you've seen in students of color or other students with minoritized or marginalized identities. It might also be, specific, not symptomatology, but specific instances. And I think we have just tons of examples, even if you can't think of one in the classroom. I think we're, again, universities don't exist in silos. And so just some of the socio-cultural political things that are happening. I know our students in our program, when the Capitol riots were occurring, right afterwards had to sit for comprehensive exams. And we've received a lot of feedback around how hard that was. And maybe they wish we would have made a different choice. So, so thinking about, what you've observed and what have you done to help, or what would you like to do if I think we can open that up. So we're going to go back up into our groups. We're going to do that again for maybe a little less than 10 minutes, and you'll get a message about when those rooms are closing.
And we'll put the prompt back into the broadcast once you guys are in the rooms.
Okay, so we're in the home stretch of our training today, and so have a few more. We have one more activity, and so we just have a little bit more content that we're gonna cover today. So we had mentioned intersectionality earlier, and we wanted to make sure that we also talked about that in an explicit way. So intersectionality is a framework, and I think increasingly it's being integrated across fields. So Kimberly Crenshaw, coined the term, and she's a legal scholar, and in her work and looking at litigation with Black women, recognizing that actually the experiences of Black women in the court systems was being, their court cases were actually being thrown out because there wasn't an acknowledgement, or they were putting forth cases that were saying we're experiencing gendered racism. And the courts were saying, well, you can't double dip. You can't say that you're experiencing both gender discrimination and racial discrimination. So you have to pick one, which is inherently problematic because one didn't quite fit there. It is both. And so really through, and also kind of Kimberly Crenshaw has been one of the folks who's really put forward critical race theory and kind of all, in an interdisciplinary way. But it's the idea that there are intersections of identity, and at these intersections, so, and some people have talked about Patricia Hill Collins, matrix of domination, kind of these other pieces, but the idea being that privilege and oppression are interlocking systems that create unique experiences, and to looking at identities in silos is actually just a really narrow picture that doesn't quite capture the complexity of identity. And so we just wanted to make sure to name that. So when we're talking about students of color, we're not thinking about students of color as a monolithic group, recognizing that there are intersections of race, not only just race, ethnicity, but gender, sexual orientation, ability status. Thank you. I wanted to thank Alicia for centering disability in our conversation as well. And so, documentation status, and also first generation college student status or level of culture. So there's all of these pieces, and it's important to look at that. So for example, this is one bit of data. If you look at who compose or comprise first generation college students, you're much more likely, students of color are much more likely to be a first generation college students than white students. And we know that there's a lot of cultural pieces, implicit cultural messages on university campuses that first generation college students, unless we make some of those cultural norms explicit, will miss. And so, I certainly can attest to that as a first generation college student myself. I didn't know that I was supposed to go talk to my professors. I thought that was only if I was in really big trouble or if I was failing a class was I supposed to do that. And it wasn't until I wanted to apply to doctoral programs that I realized I had missed all of the things that were the less spoken things about what I was supposed to be doing as an undergraduate. So it took a little catching up. So looking at the intersection of that is important to understanding student of color experience. This is one example. Other examples are, so this is data that's actually based on oh gosh, I think it was 2016, 2017 data that was collected, but the important part is it's collected on approximately 50,000 undergraduate and graduate students across 54 campuses. And one of the things that you'll see is that when you look at all the racial ethnic groups, the incidence, this talks about overall prevalence of mental health symptoms by race ethnicity. So you see, for example, Latinx and multiracial students in particular are reporting mental health symptoms. Next slide, Jesse. Yeah, so, and then this is also by gender. So if you look at, and by gender, we're talking about cisgender versus gender fluid or people or trans folks. And across the board, gender minority folks are reporting more mental health issues than cisgender folks. And again, this lends to painting the picture of mental health on university campuses. The next slide looks at it by sexual orientation. And so again, you see that, lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer questioning, folks who self-identify in another way, maybe pansexual, for example, all report higher instances of mental health symptoms than heterosexual folks do. But again, the whole point is to think it's important to know these identities. I think it's hard sometimes to get our hands on the data. I've experienced this a lot, to get my hands on the data that captures the picture that I want. I think we have inherent limitations in language and the ways we talk about identity that make truly engaging intersectionality in quantitative ways challenging. And so even the data, although the Healthy Mind study is so great and provides so much helpful data, it would be really great, and with it sometimes when we're talking about working with students of color, to be able to look at students across intersecting identities or inclusive of intersecting identities. And on university campuses, we're not quite there yet. And so, and even when I look at faculty data here at Georgia State, oftentimes it's very much, not oftentimes it's very much done in singular ways. So we really need to we want, as we move into tomorrow and the rest of today, really thinking intersectionally. And so as an example, so although we know that students of color report higher prevalence of mental health issues, in this next slide, it's looked at by race and also gender. And what you see is that across racial ethnic groups, women will report higher incidences of mental health issues than their male counterparts. Now, unfortunately, this isn't inclusive of gender spectrum, so that's another critique. However, one of the things, but I think we could probably infer, although we shouldn't, we should collect data that is actually inclusive of all genders. But looking at this data, what we would say is if we're trying to develop an initiative on a college campus, we would probably want to specify and be intentional in how we do that, because the experiences across genders is not the same.
And so the real question is, where can you begin as a faculty member or staff? And this activity that we're going to do right now will lead us into tomorrow as well. And it really builds off of this idea of developing self-awareness, right? So we know that a lot of folks think they're self-aware and like they have some level of self-aware, but we also know folks have blind spots and biases. And one of the things that Cirleen and I love to do, and it's great that that we're here to share some of these thoughts, but it's also good as you guys continue this work down the road is think about like what trainers should you bring in and think about other ways to develop self-awareness. And we know from some of the research that having other folks that's not in your unit come to do some trainings, or maybe given the fact that you guys are a 13 campus university, having folks from other campuses come down and give different perspectives could be a useful network of support. So in this exercise, this is what we call the power lines exercise. And the power lines exercise is this notion of that Cirleen was talking about, that we have different identities that give us relative power and privilege in society. And so this activity is intended to help build some self-awareness. So the boxes below are intended for you to write in different identities. So for instance, I could put down cisgender male, I could put down biracial, I could also put down able-bodied, right? So those different kinds of identities give me different levels of power. And then what we ask people to do is to write an X or put a line on the line. So if I'm cisgender male, that gives me a lot of power in society, right? Being biracial gives me less power in society. But given the fact that I'm white passing, or I can be white passing, I'm not definitely down at the bottom of the power line. Right? Able-bodied definitely gives me a lot more power in society. I don't have to think about, is this space that I'm going to enter inclusive of my ability status, right? My age, right? So what does it mean to be a 43-year-old something in this society? What does that mean, right? So you can think about all these different identities. We ask you to maybe take a screenshot of this or just write it down on a piece of paper, because this is going to lead into the next activity and discussion breakout group. So I'm gonna pause here for a second just so y'all can kind of take this down and write it down if you need be. And so as you're thinking about the different assortments of power and privilege that these different identities give you, think about it as a collective. What does this mean for you collectively within what context? So if you're thinking about yourself as a faculty member, for instance, think about the last faculty meeting you were in. How do your different positionalities of your identities give you different senses of power and privilege in that meeting even? And so this is the directions for the next activity. We want you to connect the dots between the different levels of power and privilege. And what does it mean for you as a person as you try to integrate these various dimensions? For some people, when we do this activity, they have a lot of privileged identities. They think, well, I don't want to be this person. I'm kind of angry that I'm kind of conflicted about having all this power and privilege in society, and I don't know what to do with it. Other folks feel really disenfranchised by some of their identities being less or more marginalized with less connections of power and privilege. And how do you think these identities and the collective identities work with your students? So for instance, I teach students how to be psychologists and counselors, and the majority of our field are women. And yet I know, given the fact that I am a man, the voice that I have in my therapy room with my clients is probably going to be a lot different than most of the people I train. And so how am I aware of that when I'm in my classroom? And how do I express different, and how do I bring in different voices to demonstrate there's a lot of different ways to do this. And there's a lot of different ways to be. And so in your groups, we want you to think about these things, but ultimately we want to have you think about how would a conversation go with power, right? So who is it that you think of when you think of power and privilege? Is it an image? Is it a person? Is it an institution? A lot of when I was doing this a few years ago, automatically people would just yell out Trump. Trump's the power and privilege person. So it's kind of interesting how people just assume different things from a political lens, or they assume things from like, oh, it's my dean, or it's my boss. A lot of times we want to personalize this because you're interacting with power and privilege in different ways. And so the idea here is to think about, what would you actually say to power and privilege if they were sitting in a chair across from you? What would that conversation look like? How would you start that conversation? So we're going to jump back into our discussion rooms with this idea of what would that conversation look like? How would it go? And we will take about 8 to 10 minutes. Okay, as we're coming back, I think we are about, everybody's back, I believe. Cirleen, is that correct? Okay.
Correct, yes.
All right, well, thank you all. I hope that was a good discussion. We'll continue it more tomorrow. Tomorrow we're going to be doing a little bit more activities in terms of like what to do. We ask you to bring a syllabus or other kind of document if you're not a professor, so we can start to take a look at like what could this look like in your classroom, and that syllabus being one example. But as we close today, like we gave you a lot of information. We will be sending out some more resources to all of you to make things more available in terms of what the research looks like. We have those comments in the chat, so Cirleen and I will put that into a package that's easily accessible. And as we leave today, we want you to think about action. It's one thing to attend these meetings and engage in these meetings, which I think is great. And I'm really happy that you all are here and that you all volunteer for this meeting. Shows us that you really are passionate about this work and advancing your own awareness and skills in this area. And as you think about the next thing you do, right? So then in 2 minutes, when you log off, join another meeting, and maybe it's a faculty meeting, maybe it's a staff meeting. Think about like, are these concepts ever talked about in those meetings? I know in my faculty meetings, we rarely ever talk about microaggressions that are happening, unless it's something that blows up in our program. But we don't talk about it proactively, and it makes me curious about other programs and other department meetings about who should bring this up and how should we talk about this in these spaces. If your departments are talking about it, that's great, and I hope it's going well. And for those who don't have these kind of conversations in these meetings, the question should be, why not? And so just think about the different spaces that you're in and what kind of conversations you're having with other folks and be it colleagues or be it student advising meetings. Think about some tangible action that you can take to kind of disrupt the system that pushes these types of issues under the rug. So we're going to stop there today. Cirleen, any final comments from you?
No, that was it. Yeah. And I think sometimes we can't always think about it or, think about it. I appreciated what Jesse said too about like our classrooms, but, thinking about it in faculty meetings, the number of times I've sat in a faculty meeting and thought it was a social psych experiment, innumerable. Because I was just like, okay, who's talking first? Who's taking up all the space? Who's getting, like all of those. So we have so many spaces that I think the opportunities to disrupt are there. And I think, using some of the strategies we talked about earlier, like just approaching some of those spaces with some curiosity of, oh, I'm noticing this. I think in inviting people in and having those brave spaces. So just be thinking and anticipating for tomorrow where we are going to really try to identify some concrete steps, because I do think sometimes when we talk about having inclusive campuses or inclusive curriculum, I think sometimes folks are really like wanting to know what's an example, what's a concrete thing. And so we hope to be able to provide you with some of those things tomorrow as well.
So again, thank you all for coming, and we hope to see you tomorrow.